Okay, so when I was growing up, let me get back to the map. There we go. Growing up in northern Ghana in the Frafra area, there was a bride wealth, and that existed um, alongside, that was for traditional law, and that existed alongside church law and government law. So people who wanted to get married, people who want to get married can always just, shack up. You don't have to do the official ceremony. Um, and so people would do that, and sometimes they were Christians, and so they would go to the pastor and say, "Look, we want to get married." And the pastor would say, "Are your parents on board?" They'd be like, "No." But in those days, back in the '80s, sometimes Christians were few and far between, and so even though um, you're wanting to marry another Christian, that it's hard to find other Christians who are suitable to your parents. So, they would be pretty close to just going ahead and shacking up. And so the pastor would say, "Okay, no, I'm just going to go ahead and marry you." So people would get married. They'd be married sometimes for a decade. And have kids, have two, three, four kids, and the boy would go back home. Young man would go back home, and his auntie would say, "When are you going to get married?" And he'd say, "Mom, I am married. I've been married. I went and got the marriage license, and I went to the church, and I've been married to this woman for 10 years." And she'd be like, "Not that person you're hooking up with. I want grandkids. I want real grandkids who belong to this house. Not the kids you're producing for that other house over there." And it's true. The other, if you're not legally married under church law, traditional law, and you haven't exchanged the cattle, then the kids don't belong to the house. Um, and so they belong to their mother's house, and they're not full citizens over there. They don't get the same share of inheritance as they would if you would go ahead and pay it. So sometimes these marriages get legalized pretty late. The guy's in his 40s or 50s before he can raise enough money to go ahead and get married legally. Um, and then all the kids are transferred over at once uh, as full citizens. Um, and sometimes that takes a while. If you're ever wondering why we have so many men, single men, working as cab drivers in our cities, sometimes legally here, sometimes not legally, the point is that there's a load of money to be made, and they're trying to raise that $5,000 or $10,000 that they would otherwise have to borrow from family members to get married back in Egypt or Pakistan or wherever they're trying to get married, because they want to marry the woman they love, and they can't do it because their family members won't give them the money. So anyway, I'm just saying this. Yeah, this is also a nice thing to talk about gay marriage with, because church law was always in favor of same-sex marriage. At least you always find a church that would marry you. It was only the government law and traditional law, whatever that is, in the United States that was opposed to it. So, I mean, that's a big deal. Alimony and child support is enormous, and had lots and lots of friends who were married prior to the law changing to accommodate same-sex marriages, who ended up in really a bad situation because even though they had gone through a really rough divorce, they'd been left by their spouse. They could not get any sort of relief because legally they hadn't been married according to the government in the United States. Other countries, of course, went ahead with that a lot earlier. So back to marriage here. Oh goodness, we jumped ahead a bit. I was Okay, so this is bride wealth. Oh, right. So back to Ghana. Basically, so you get married finally. Um, you get all your money lined up. Sorry, your cattle. You get your four cattle. You get the marriage done, and then it's a really really tight bond. That's kind of a problem because what that does is that makes the marriage continuing contingent on the family not being really cool with returning the four cows. So basically, what happens is people can't afford to do this. It's really expensive. So a man who wants to get married will have to wait until his little sister's married off. So his little sister's married off to that guy. and then they get 4 cows for her, and then they flip the 4 cows over to get their son married, and their son gets married to that family over there, and that family over there can now marry off their daughter to this person back here. Can marry off their son to this person back here, who now that they've been able to get their daughter married off, then they're going to marry off their son to this one. So basically, what happens is once a marriage takes place, it triggers several other marriages in the whole community, and then these marriages are all locked in. And if one of them breaks up, if a husband is abusive to his wife, and she goes home to her dad and says, "Look, I didn't know he's a terrible guy. I don't want to be married to him anymore." Her dad and her brothers would say, "Tough." Your brother's not getting divorced because you couldn't take it. And so they'll take her back, and so it enables a tremendous amount of abuse and violence against women to have these really. I mean, the marriages are really, really solid, right? Nobody ever gets divorced, but it does enable a lot of abuse as well. The opposite situation took place over here. This is 40 miles away, completely different language, completely different culture. And so one of the things that they have over in Sandema is they don't have a 4 cow bride price. They just had a sheep. And so a sheep is like $50. You can go work a couple months and save that up. Um, and so a lot of people would get married. Um, uh, a lot of people. There was a pastor once who lived somewhere along in here who was a pastor, so he's not making any money and sort of not really in good terms with his family, but he still wants to get married, and so he finds out that you can get married over here without the 4 cows, and so he wants to do a traditional marriage. Uh, but he also wants to, be able to do it on the cheap, and so he marries her, and she goes home with him. And the first time he gets mad and says something mean to her, she up and leaves. She's like going back to her dad's house. And so he, being from this area, is still thinking, oh, I'll just sit around, and eventually her brothers will drag her back kicking and screaming because after all, we're married. A couple months later, he realizes, oh, when I got married, somebody finally tells him, when I got married, I didn't pay off 4 cows, and then that's good. Basically, every year then, and every few months, and every few years, he has to come back and keep good relations with his in-laws so that she'll stay. And he once he learned that he had to do that, then he started doing that, and he brought gifts every few months, every few years. He would bring another kind of gift, another sheep, whatever. You're just paying for the rest of your life. And then she came back, and he apologized, and she came back, and so they're still happily married. It's all cool. It's just it takes a little bit of adjusting sometimes to get away from that bride wealth. And there's also much higher divorce rates over here, and probably less spousal abuse because women are empowered to leave their abusers. In any case, we have the second one is marriage without love. Marriage is an economic decision. Um, Still in many countries, and it is somewhat to a certain extent in the United States as well. Marriage does confer economic benefits, and a lot of people who don't have kids don't get married. But then once they start having kids, they realize there's so much in terms of tax breaks and stuff, um, and in terms of inheritance and child support and child custody and just all sorts of stuff. Is just legally and economically makes much more sense to get married. Um, and really, it's the economic factor that changed it for our Supreme Court to decide that same-sex marriage is really should be legal because of the economic damage that you take if you're not married. Polygyny, marriage of one man to two or more women at the same time. We don't have that in the United States. We have serial monogamy. But often rich men in the United States will get divorces as an index of wealth. Definitely in Ghana, when a man took on a second or third wife, this was seen as proof of his financial wizardry, right? As someone who can make so much money that he can afford to have a second wife is truly rich. And this is the norm for 80% of societies in the world. So human beings are polygamous for the most part. It's only a few exceptions, for example, the United States, where polygamy is outlawed. But I had a, but the serial monogamy is still a thing. I had an acquaintance once who was talking about his business, and I was saying, why didn't you do this, that, back in 2009? He said, yeah, I remember, it was really great. Sorry, in 2007, before the crash, you could do, you could do three things. You could grow the business in this way, or you could get a boat, or you could get a divorce. And so I went for the third. Kind of a joke, but kind of having an affair and producing a child with someone you're not married to, and then telling the first wife that you're divorcing her and paying alimony and all that, and going through the divorce settlement, and then remarrying to the new wife with the new kids. This is very, very expensive, and sort of shows how rich and powerful you are if you're sort of into all that masculinity and power.